So this week we're going to do some review of genitive and then dative and all the things that you have learned about genitive and dative over the last year, and then we're going to talk about one new thing with dative. So the very first thing you learned about genitive was genitive of possession. By the way, make sure you have your note pages out. We will fill these out together so that you have them already done when you come to class. So, genitive of possession, very first thing that you learn, it expresses ownership or belonging. It probably is the most common thing that we see in English as well. Now, in English, we'll use it with an apostrophe S, but in Latin, remember, they didn't have any of that, so they used the genitive case, so they would know that what was being possessed. So if we did arma viri, it'd be literally translated, because remember, we always use an of the arms of the man. But in English, of course, we would say, just because it seems less awkward and it's shorter, the man's arms with an apostrophe S. Now, genitive of origin was the second kind of genitive that you learned. And basically, where do you come from? Right? Where does something come from? I would be Magister Reichlen from California. And that in Latin would use, if they knew the word for California, would be using the genitive. So it expresses the place from which a person or group originates. It expresses the place from which a person or group originates. That's why it's called genitive of origin. Now, if we were going to talk about Cleopatra Aegypti, right? A Cleopatra Aegypti, Cleopatra of Egypt, you would use the genitive case. And remember, we've got the of right there, right? So what's in the genitive is this word right here, Aegypti, just like weary is also in the genitive. Okay, whose arms are they? Of the man. They belong to the man. Where does Cleopatra come from? Where does she belong to? Egypt. Now, the genitive of material, that basically means from what did you make something? Was it clay? Was it brick? Was it iron? What did you make or create something from? So it expresses the material from which something is created. Expresses the material. That's basically a fancy word for stuff. Expresses the material from which something is created. So here we have the genitive on ferry, gladius ferry. So here we have an of again, sword of iron. Yes, you could say the iron sword, but sword of iron, just to show you that's the of, what it's made of. And the last one that you learn is called partitive genitive, and that simply is part of the whole. So it expresses the whole or group of, remember, because we've got the of, which something is a part. Is it a piece of pie, right? Is it a slice of apple? The apple is the whole and the slice is the part. So it expresses the whole or group of which something is a part. Now, if we said pars panis, we would mean, here's our genitive, a piece of bread. Those are the four genitive uses that you have learned in Latin 1. And we're doing a reminder of them because you didn't use them all that much and it's easy to fall out of your head. So let's go on and let's talk about dative. Now in in English, the dative is referred to as the indirect object. You remember the accusative is what we call the direct object. It directly receives the action of the verb. The indirect object, or you'll sometimes hear it as the IO. That's the indirect object in Latin. That's the dative. Now it describes the object to which something is given, said, or done. And it does not receive the action of the verb directly, but it's affected by it. Remember we talked about in the very beginning, giving, showing, and telling verbs are signals that there's going to be an indirect object or the dative. So here we go. This is the dative. Puella donum, puero dat. The girl gives a gift to the boy. And we don't always have to have that to or for in there. In English, we can do the same by saying the girl gives the boy a gift. Same thing. We just say it a little neater and cleaner when we say it that way in English. Now, the second kind of dative that you learned is the dative of reference or the dative of interest. So it's similar to the indirect object, but it also describes something that is not directly receiving the action of the verb, but it is the object or person to which a statement refers. So it's the object or person to which a statement refers. So similar in that it doesn't directly receive the action. Okay? The dative case signifies the person for whom the action is of interest, or who the action kind of might refer to. So let's take a look at here. Puero, again, is in our dative for the boy. Puella donum, puera habet. The girl has a gift for the boy. All right, so there's how our dative gets translated. We've got that to or for in there, right? You don't always have to, but here in this case, you have the to or the for. So opidum, sociis, there's our dative again. Edificaverunt. They built a town for the allies. Again, they didn't build the allies. They built the town. That's the accusative. But really, who is of it of interest? The allies, because the allies are affected by the town. So here we go. You can say it without the to or for. They built the allies a town, but that becomes so they did again. That becomes a little more English. In English, easier to say. They built the allies a town. Then they built a town for the allies, but they're both equally appropriate and grammatically correct. Okay, so sometimes it says to or for. Sometimes it makes better English sense if you use just a different phrase without the to or the for. And remember, now that you're in Latin 2, you're going to begin to have to go, which makes good English sense when I translate it. It's not going to be as easy as Latin 1, but always good English sense is primary. Now, special intransitive, we talked about these last week in our review of kinds of sentences, and this kind of sentence uses verbs that take a dative object, not an accusative, and those are special kinds of verbs. You remember that they'll have a plus dat after them in the dictionary, and basically there's two ways to translate this kinds of verbs. You'll see this. So if we do deo, here we have the dative and how it gets translated. Deo parebimus, we will be obedient to God. There it is in the to or the for, the normal dative that we're used to. But you can also say we will obey God. So when you look at this verb in the dictionary, it'll say two ways to translate the verb: obedient to, or just obedient. And depending on how you want to translate, you can choose either one of those. All right, let's take a look again Again, best English sense. Let's take a look at datives with adjectives. Now, there's a special group of adjectives that often appears with the dative case. And again, in the dictionary, it'll have a plus DAT, plus dative after it. So these adjectives don't have to use a dative, but they often do in order to show quality, relation, or even an attitude toward a subject. Now, remember, you won't be wrong if you don't use a dative in this sentence, but you're going to need to understand when you're translating Latin to English why there's a dative there with this adjective. Otherwise, it will seem out of place. So let's take a look at that. So first one, I'm going to give you these two that are paired together. Okay. War is not suitable for children. All right, we've got the dative right here. Here's the adjective. Here's the dative. So the adjective is not in the dative, but the thing that it's describing does appear in the dative. So they don't. If you notice that these two don't match. Okay. Saxum similem testudini formam habet. The rock has a shape like or similar to a turtle. So here we go. The testudini is in the dative. So the adjective appears with the dative case. Okay. All right. Let's talk about dative of possession. So remember, we had genitive of possession, right? Expresses ownership or belonging in its simplest form. The very, very end of last year, you learned the dative of possession. And it was kind of confusing because it's not that common, certainly not as common at all as the genitive of possession. But if you see it, this is why it's here, and we're going to practice it a little bit and do some review on it. So the dative of possession uses a form of the verb esse. Remember? Sum, esse. It's the to be verb. Fui, futurum. Uses the form of the verb esse to show ownership. So, but in this kind of construction, the verb esse is not translated as to be, right? Because normally that's what that infinitive is translated to be. But it translates to belong to. So a little bit different, which is why it's confusing, I think, for most Latin students, because we always notice the to be verb, and suddenly it can have a couple different or additional meanings to it. So the verb's number, which means singular or plural, depends on the number of things being possessed, not the number of things doing the possessing. So keep that in your mind when you do a translation. So, and when you do a label and an ending. So you may also translate this construction in a seemingly backwards manner. The dative is made the subject, and esse as the English verb to have. So let's take a look at that. Here we go. We've got a to be verb here. Here's normally our dative, right? Typical translation from the top here. The office belongs to, right? Here we got to belong to. The office belongs to the consul. And we've got the consuli in dative. Now here, if we're going to do it the second way, where we've taken the consul, it's still in the dative, but in English, we've made it the subject. Still leave it in dative, but in English, we have it be the subject. The consul has the office. And then here's our verb translated as to have. Okay? So second one, discipules, that's clearly in the dative. Here we have a form of the to be verb, right? The books belonged to the students. Now, we translate that as errant. You remember aramaras arat, aramasuраtas arant. That is it's not in the perfect form, but we do it with an ed here because that makes the most English sense. We wouldn't say the books were belonging to. Just belonged is fine. This year you can begin to take the imperfect and use it more interchangeably with the perfect tense. Remember I told you you weren't allowed to do that last year. Now you can. Now you can do it in the way that makes the most sense, because that's what the Romans did. The imperfect and the perfect were a little more interchangeable. In some places they're not, but in a lot of places they are. So here we go. To the students, that again is your dative, and we have the belong to, right, with that form of the to be verb. Now here, again, we take the subject, the students, we take the Latin dative, and in English we turn it around and make it the subject. It still stays in the dative case, but when you translate it, you can make it as the subject, and then of course we use a form again of to have. The students had the books. And we make it perfect, because to say imperfect, the students were having the books, makes it sound like they were eating them for lunch. So make good English sense. Use the perfect form if you need to. All right. One more thing. Predicate dative. This is the new thing that you need to learn this week. We've gone through the review of the genitive cases you've known so far. We've gone through the review of all the kinds of dative cases and their uses that you've known so far. Now we're going to do dative of purpose. So the dative case may also express the purpose that someone or something serves. It expresses what something is intended to be. I did this, or I did this thing, or I sent these people. What was my intention? What was my desire for them? Okay, so if I said optant Caesarem duci. So here we have in the dative, they desire or want Caesar for a leader. So there's the for if you want to use it. You would either say they desire, want Caesar for a leader, or you could say they want Caesar as a leader. Optant Caesarem duci. Okay. Another way to do it. Here we go. Dative again, auxilio. What was their intention? He sent these soldiers for help. Right? So what was his intention? He sent them for help. This is to be a help to someone else kind of thing. So, or for help, to go find help, right? What was his intention of sending the soldiers? That is called dative of purpose. The last one is dative of result. Now, the dative also frequently expresses what something tends to become, results in being, or merely is. It occurs mostly with the verb essay. It doesn't have to, but occurs mostly with the verb essay, usually with a dative of result. Who do these results pertain to? That's the dative of result. Who do these results pertain to? Okay. Because there are two datives involved, is often called the double dative. So when you have a dative of reference plus, which we just learned up here, dative of dative of reference earlier. Dative of reference, who does it go to? Plus a dative of purpose, that equals a double dative. So using those two things together, the new thing that's created together is called the double dative. And then when you hear double dative, that's because there's a dative of reference and a dative of purpose in there, right? It's called a double dative or a dative of result. Okay. So mihi, that's the reference. Curai, that's the purpose. This would be called a double dative. Mihi curai est. He is a care for me. Now that sounds really weird, but he is a care to me. There's one dative, there's the other dative, right? He is a care to me. That's literally translated. If you want to translate so it makes a little more English sense, you would say he is of importance to me, right? All right. Next one. Milites nobis, that's a dative of reference, and auxilio, that is a dative of purpose. The soldiers came as a help to us. So as a help, auxilio, that's the dative of purpose, to us. Who or what was it for? What was it intended for, right? Nobis. Okay. They don't directly get the action, but they're referred to. And they should be interested in the fact that the soldiers came for help. So dative of interest or reference. All right, so let's take a look at some examples in English, because that will help you of all the different kinds of datives. So do take a look at the word. There's a bunch in here that have a to be in it. Remember, that's that odd form of to be instead of SA. When it's SA, it's there. So let's go ahead and take a look at some examples of dative being used in the English. Sometimes if you get stuck in the Latin because you're not as familiar with the grammar, if you take a look at examples in the English, it'll help you to understand what's going on in the Latin. So look at a couple of them. They use the to be verb right here, and they also use that in the dative possession. Remember, the form of essay, but it means belongs to. Take a look at that. Those are often clues that you're going to have a dative. So the first one is the indirect object. The boy gives a bone to the dog. What that is the accusative bone is being given. So the direct object is related to the indirect object. The direct object it's given to, it receives the direct object. First one you learned, often with a giving, showing, telling verb. Pretty easy there. Dative of reference. The boy has a bone for the dog. Again, dative right here, but it's referring to something. Or it's also, remember, called the dative of interest. The dog's probably going to be interested in what the boy has for the dog, right? Okay, special intransitive. The dog is pleasing to the boy. So here we have to the boy. And what that is, do you remember there's some verbs that can have that take a dative object instead of having an accusative after them? That's one of them. So dative with adjectives. So here we have the adjective friendly. And who is he friendly to? To the boy. So remember, friendly isn't necessarily in the dative, but to the boy is. And again, that will have a plus dat after it. Doesn't have to have a dative, but we often will see it in the dative. So dative of possession. Remember, we had genitive of possession that expresses ownership or belonging, but we also had dative of possession. It can also show ownership, but instead when we had a form of essay, and it can be translated as to belong to, or you could say, we could take the boy and say the boy has the dog. So we take what was the dative, and we take the dative and put it at the beginning of the sentence as the subject, and we use the form has, right, instead of belongs to. Two ideas there. Remember, the boy still stays in the dative case in either spot. Last one is dative of purpose, which is your new one. What is the purpose that something serves? Well, here, for a pet, that would be in the dative, because it tells us what purpose the dog has. The purpose of the dog is for a pet for the boy. And basically a double dative is when you take a dative of reference, which was the boy, and a dative of purpose, which was the pet, and put them together. So the dative of reference, so the dog is for a pet for the boy. And that's sounds a little awkward, but it's totally right. So for the boy would be dative, because it refers what he's for. Remember, this doesn't have an action verb this time, right? And for a pet. What's the pet's purpose? This is also in the dative. The purpose of the dog is for a pet. So the dog does not in dative, but for a pet and for the boy would be in dative.